Hello, my name is Howard Lake from UK Fundraising, and I'm delighted today to be talking to Daryl Upsall of Daryl Upsall International. Hi, Daryl, how are you?
Hi, Howard. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I believe this week is a very special week for you and your organisation. Tell us more.
It is indeed. We were or are 20 years as of yesterday. Now, clearly, we were not too busy on a Sunday, but we are really celebrating and recognising the 20 years of the sector and what we've done during that period.
And tell us about the various services that Daryl Upsall International has provided over the years, from when you first started with, I think, one laptop and an IKEA unit in one room.
Indeed, and I'm even sitting at the same IKEA furniture brought from Amsterdam some 20 years ago and set up as my intended home office. And thanks to COVID, it still is. We've grown from a one home office organisation to within our group of companies, 250 employees. And we're still doing from the consulting and recruitment side, very much a similar service, but I'd say far better, far more professional and far wider than we ever did before.
Focusing on primarily international and national NGOs?
I would say our primary focus has really always been with the international NGOs, the UN agencies, the sort of big international bodies that are often looking to expand, both in terms of markets, but also sometimes expand in terms of different channels within existing market or optimizing their fundraising in the existing markets.
I think 20 years ago, you presented a rather insightful presentation at the second Spanish fundraising conference. You were looking at where will fundraising be in 10 years from now, which puts it to 2011. So we're even looking back 10 years ago and where you were looking forward. Can you remember producing that and what you were at the time?
Indeed. I guess I had a certain advantage because I'd come from working for 7 years at Greenpeace, which I would say was pioneering, certainly in digital fundraising and things like Facebook. But looking outward, it was an interesting time because many of the things that now dominate our fundraising worldwide, whether that's the use of social media, digital, even things like the size of the screen I was writing my PowerPoint in has changed. I think as well, what is kind of very different is I think fundraising was really beginning to globalize at that point or internationalize, and now I'd say it's really pretty fully globalized. We're working in the furthest reaches of Asia, Africa, South America. Fundraising is everywhere and increasingly professionalized, I'd say.
I like the beginning of it. I had a quick look at these slides again today, and you started with a very positive view, which is good. That's how fundraisers have to be. You quoted Gertrude Stein, "I have seen the future and it works." So whatever the future is, we have to make it work as fundraisers, which I enjoyed. I've enjoyed your focus right from the beginning on understanding our past, the fundraising past. We should understand our past to prepare for the future. We should embrace change and make it work for us, which I think is pretty much sort of guidance for any fundraiser in any decade, if they can achieve that.
I think part of the reason for doing that is I've worked a great deal in the United States, for example, even served as vice chair of the Association of Fundraising Professionals there. And I'm always shocked when, I hear people ask me questions like, wow, do you really do fundraising in Europe? It's usually the same person will ask me, is Europe a communist country? But, still, it's kind of discouraging because if we think about fundraising, it goes back to the beginning of time. Things were built like universities, cathedrals, huge, monuments, usually through some form of fundraising or taxation. And therefore, we're only building on the stones and the building blocks of the past, really.
Yeah. And I love the fact that there were mistakes made along the way, and there's also mistakes made by some very insightful fundraisers. I think you quote George Smith, the late lamented George Smith from 1987, who confidently declared of, I think, the UK market, telephone fundraising won't work here, which is wonderful. And you followed that up with a quote from the very same George Smith in 1989, which was, "I was wrong," which is marvelous.
From George.
No, but all of us get it wrong, which when you're looking back 10, 20 years, I think it's really important to work out. So being ready to adapt should work, which I would say you've probably followed and helped support charities through for all that period.
Indeed, it's quite funny. I'm surprised I didn't have some quote from Darwin about evolution and the strongest and so forth that evolve to survive. I think what has been probably the most surprising me is how slow people have adapted. I recall, and I think you may have been present, Howard, when the Institute of Fundraising put on a conference and we presented digital fundraising at the Channel 4 TV studio
Yes.
or theatre.
Yeah.
And I asked the audience, along with Mike Johnston and others, has anybody heard of www? And nobody had. Nobody had an email. And certainly nobody had seen anything like internet. And yet Greenpeace was raising $50,000 a month online at that point. And how long has it taken for some of the big organizations, even today, to think about getting $50,000, euros, pound online? It's taken a lot longer than I thought, I'd say.
Mm.
So sometimes I think I predicted the future before its time.
There were a good few there. I think some have certainly proven the test of time, and I'll be asking you shortly to try and work out what is coming based on those 20 years can we predict. So you pointed out that CRM will be the most important issue for charity in terms of their long-term support base, which I think no one would really disagree with. Also that donors will expect a 24/7 high-quality service, as good as the best in the commercial sector. And I think that was very far-sighted. I don't think many donors do expect us to offer 24-hour a day, but still they are expecting the service that they get from commercial.
I think I was basing that on the early EasyJet and the fact you could go online and book your ticket and change your details. And I've just been, just an hour ago, going through the horrendous task of registering to come from Spain to the UK and fill in all the forms and book my COVID test on day 2 that I know nobody on the planet will ever look at. And, realizing that actually even today, how many donors can log in and say, actually, I'm just going to change my personal details, or I'm going to upgrade or downgrade my gift. I don't think actually we're giving donors in most organizations the same level of access as the airlines or other institutions are giving. So, 24/7, there's nothing worse than calling a non-profit in the world and say, sorry, we close at 5 o'clock, which often they do.
So digital evolution rather than revolution for the sector.
Well, I think
Possibly.
COVID's caused a kind of quasi-revolution. It's actually forced I wrote an article not long ago about pirouetting, and I think organizations suddenly have to not just change the way they do their funding, but pirouette and become more adaptive and more, in some ways, beautiful in the way they were doing things because they had to. And had that not happened, I think we'd still be back in the non-digital world in most cases.
So is that the role, do you think, of all these attempts to foresee the future 10 years or even, dare I say, 20 years? Is it effectively laying out a sort of series of challenges? Some of them will be wrong, but maybe some of them are actually not instructions, but challenges for charities to...
That's a good way of putting it, I think. I draw upon my experience in earlier organizations, whether that was working in HIV/AIDS or working with Greenpeace, or in fact, when we did the campaign for Mandela. Mandela and his team, or his team in the Europe office, said, we need £1 million. How much budget do you have? 0. We need to raise it within 6 months. And off you go as a volunteer, as a group of us did. And of course, we raised £2.5 million. But what did we do? We asked people to become monthly donors from day 1 till the day of the election, and then stopped all direct debits, as it was in those days. And it could be done. And I think that pushing of the ticket, particularly of monthly giving, has been a kind of personal obsession of mine. And sometimes forcing the argument, especially in the US again, where it wasn't always welcome.
Yeah, long-term reliable support, essential. So go on then, let's have a go. What do you think for the next, let's give you 10 years rather than 20. What's going to stay the same? What's the sector done well so far that you think will actually develop faster and better to serve the organizations and people that we fundraise for on behalf of?
Well, let's start with people anyway. I think the biggest single crisis facing the non-profit sector globally is the shortage of people, especially at the leadership level. And I think one of the roles that we have as more, shall we say, experienced senior people in the community is to actually really provide support and assistance through trainings, conferences, whatever, to build the next level of leadership, because next generation. In the US, it's a much researched crisis. 50% of all fundraising director roles are vacant at any given time, and often for a period of 6 months. And we see that in other parts of the world. I think the other challenge we have is make it a more diverse community of fundraisers and donors. And I think we've been very, very poor historically at facing that. Digital's going to drive ahead, but I have a big fear. I think we're so dependent on Google and Facebook for generating leads and creating the platforms for telling stories, that we are in danger of, one piece of legislation suddenly could wipe out the growth that's been made through people like Facebook online. I think the big thing for the future is AI. I think increasingly that 24/7 service will be easily offered as it is in the commercial sector by bots that, quite frankly, can be pretty good and helpful and solve certain technical issues, perhaps with your gift, maybe your planning and making sure you get the information you want. But I think pretty much most things are going to be digital. And the one thing I think I've been totally wrong at predicting and had a part in innovating was face-to-face.
Yes.
I think face-to-face will go on, but it will evolve. And it has evolved enormously during COVID. And I think it will continue to do so because people do, in many parts of the world, still really like having a conversation.
And long may that last.
Yeah.
Daryl Upsall, thank you very much for our conversation.
Thank you very much,
now.
Matt.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It has. Thank you.